The desert sun beat down mercilessly on Fort Daniels, an imposing military complex sprawling across the Arizona landscape like a small city carved from sand and concrete. Established in 1943, the base had evolved into one of the Army's premier advanced training centers, where elite units came to hone skills that couldn't be learned in conventional programs. The facility housed everything from cyber warfare specialists to special operations candidates, creating an environment where exceptional was considered merely adequate. Captain James Crawford stood at the center of the evaluation platform, his uniform pressed to razor precision, his posture military perfect, as he surveyed the assembled soldiers with the aggressive confidence of a man who had risen through the ranks quickly and intended to continue that trajectory. At 37, Crawford carried himself with the perpetual intensity of someone who viewed every interaction as a potential test of his authority. 300 soldiers watched in tense silence the collective breath of the gathering held, as Crawford's voice cut through the desert heat like a combat knife. "Soldier Reeves, remove your uniform top, now!" The command struck the evaluation platform like a physical blow, creating shock silence among the instructors who recognized Crawford had crossed boundaries that separated legitimate military discipline from inappropriate personal humiliation. Sophia Reeves stood at attention, her expression revealing nothing of the storms that had shaped her life. At 42, she possessed the kind of unremarkable appearance that allowed her to blend into crowds without effort. Average height, shoulder-length auburn hair always pulled back in regulation style, and a face that kept emotions locked away behind professional discipline. For 5 weeks now, she had been the enigma of Fort Daniels. Her fingers moved to the zipper of her uniform top with movements that appeared calm despite the public humiliation unfolding before hundreds of witnesses. The metal teeth separated with a soft sound that seemed impossibly loud in the desert silence. As the fabric fell away to reveal the olive tank top underneath, Sophia turned slightly to adjust her position in the heat. That small movement revealed what had been hidden beneath her uniform for 5 weeks. A tattoo between her shoulder blades that made Sergeant Major Patricia Wells take a sharp breath and caused Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Hayes to step forward with sudden recognition. The Iron Eagle insignia emerged into view like a ghost materializing from shadow. A snarling eagle's head surrounded by crossed lightning bolts and 7 stars arranged in a pattern that looked random to most observers, but carried specific meaning for anyone with knowledge of classified special operations. From the edge of the platform, General William Morrison, 68 years old with a face weathered by decades of command decisions, stared at the tattoo. His weathered features went pale with recognition, eyes widening with the shock of seeing something that shouldn't exist outside the most classified files in the Pentagon. When he spoke, his voice carried the absolute authority that came from 4 decades of military service. Crawford, Morrison said, each syllable measured and heavy with consequence. "You've just made the most serious military mistake of your career." The Iron Eagle wasn't just a military tattoo, it was identification of participation in operations that were classified beyond normal military security protocols. The silence that followed Morrison's pronouncement was absolute, the kind of profound quiet that occurs when reality shifts so dramatically that everyone present requires time to process what they're witnessing. 5 weeks earlier, Sophia Thompson had arrived at Fort Daniels on a Tuesday morning with paperwork that raised more questions than it answered. Her transfer orders bore signatures from Pentagon offices that most base personnel had never heard of, stamped with clearance codes that made the administrative staff uncomfortable. When pressed for details about her background, she simply stated that her previous assignment was classified and provided a contact number that led to a recorded message requesting the caller leave their information for verification purposes. From day one, the other soldiers had begun talking about her. During morning PT, while others struggled through obstacle courses designed to push human endurance to its limits, Sophia completed every exercise with a fluid precision that looked almost effortless. She never appeared winded, never showed strain, never celebrated completion. She simply finished, made notes in a small leather journal she kept secured in her cargo pocket, and moved on to whatever came next. Her shooting scores were perfect. Not good, not exceptional, but mathematically perfect in a way that suggested she wasn't trying to impress anyone. She was simply demonstrating a baseline level of competence that happened to exceed everyone else's maximum effort. What made the other soldiers most uncomfortable wasn't her skill. The military respected competence above almost everything else. It was her detachment. Sophia participated in every exercise, followed every order, completed every task with professional efficiency, but she remained emotionally removed from the experience. She watched them struggle, watched them fail, watched them succeed, and her expression never changed. The base's training regimen was designed to identify weaknesses and eliminate them through controlled stress. Soldiers were pushed to their breaking points physically, mentally, and emotionally. Their responses carefully monitored by instructors who had seen every possible variation of human behavior under pressure. But Sophia never reached a breaking point. She adapted to every challenge with the same calm efficiency as if she were running through exercises she had performed countless times before. Her silence became legendary. While other soldiers bonded over shared misery, complained about unfair treatment, or celebrated small victories, Sophia simply observed. She ate her meals alone, never speaking unless directly addressed, and even then her responses were minimal and professional. Yes, sir. No, sir. Understood. She volunteered no information about herself, asked no questions about others, and showed no interest in forming the relationships that typically develop between soldiers facing shared hardships. But it was her eyes that unnerved people most. They held a depth that suggested experiences beyond anything most soldiers would ever face. When instructors delivered briefings on combat scenarios, Sophia listened with the attention of someone reviewing familiar material rather than learning new concepts. When they described the psychological pressures of warfare, she nodded with the understanding of someone who had lived through those pressures rather than simply studied them. The mess hall at Fort Daniels buzzed with the familiar energy of soldiers unwinding after morning drills. Steam rose from industrial-sized coffee urns, while hundreds of conversations created a steady hum that echoed off concrete walls decorated with faded motivational posters and unit insignias. Sophia sat alone at a corner table methodically eating scrambled eggs while making notes in her leather journal. She had positioned herself with a clear view of the entire facility, a habit developed during missions where situational awareness meant the difference between life and death. From her vantage point, she could observe the natural social hierarchies that formed among the soldiers, the alliances and rivalries that developed under stress, the way information flowed through informal networks that often carried more weight than official communications. 3 tables away, Sergeant Rebecca Mason held court with a group of female soldiers who seemed to gravitate toward her natural charisma. Mason was the kind of person who commanded attention without effort, blonde with the kind of confident bearing that suggested she had never doubted her place in any environment. Her uniform was perfectly pressed, her hair arranged in a regulation style that somehow managed to look fashionable, and her makeup applied with precision, despite base regulations that discouraged such attention to appearance. Mason's voice carried easily across the noise of the mess hall, a skill developed through years of addressing groups of soldiers in less than ideal conditions. "I'm telling you," she said, gesturing with her coffee cup for emphasis, "there's something seriously off about Reeves. 5 weeks here and nobody knows anything about her background. That's not normal protocol." The women around her nodded in agreement, drawn into Mason's certainty like metal filings to a magnet. Corporal Sarah Walsh, a communications specialist with nervous energy that manifested in constant fidgeting, leaned forward conspiratorially. "My friend in admin tried to pull her file yesterday. Half of it's redacted and the other half requires clearance levels she doesn't have." "Exactly," Mason replied, satisfaction evident in her tone. "Nobody just shows up here with that kind of classified background unless they're hiding something. And look at her." From across the room, Mason's eyes found Sophia with predatory precision. "She sits alone, never talks to anyone, acts like she's better than the rest of us. But watch her during exercises. She's going through the motions like she's bored or something. That's not dedication, that's arrogance." Private Jordan Walsh, Sarah's younger brother who had arrived at the base 2 weeks earlier, shook his head in frustration. "It's insulting, honestly. We've all earned our spots here through years of service deployments, proving ourselves in the field, and she just shows up with mysterious paperwork and gets treated like she belongs." The conversation was drawing attention from neighboring tables, creating ripples of interest that spread throughout the mess hall like waves from a dropped stone. Soldiers paused their own discussions to listen, their curiosity piqued by the unusual topic of someone who had managed to remain enigmatic in an environment where privacy was nearly impossible to maintain. Captain Crawford noticed the commotion from his position near the officers' section of the mess hall. He had been watching Sophia since her arrival, and what he saw bothered him on multiple levels. Her calm competence during training exercises made other soldiers look inadequate by comparison, which reflected poorly on his ability to maintain unit cohesion. Her mysterious background suggested connections that could potentially supersede his own authority. Most importantly, her presence created questions that he couldn't answer, and Crawford had built his career on being the person who had all the answers. He approached Mason's table with the measured stride of someone accustomed to having conversations stop when he arrived. The female soldiers immediately straightened their casual chatter, shifting into the more formal demeanor appropriate when addressing a superior officer. "Sergeant Mason," Crawford said, his voice pitched to carry beyond their immediate group. "I couldn't help but overhear your concerns about Soldier Reeves. Perhaps you'd like to share your observations with someone who might be able to address them." Mason's eyes lit up with the satisfaction of someone whose complaints were finally being taken seriously by someone with the authority to act on them. "Sir, it's not just me. Multiple soldiers have expressed concerns about Reeves's presence here. Her attitude seems inconsistent with the collaborative environment we're trying to maintain." Crawford nodded thoughtfully, playing the role of the concerned commanding officer, weighing the welfare of his unit. "What specific behaviors have you observed that concern you?" "She doesn't participate in group activities, sir. Doesn't engage in the team-building exercises that are supposed to create unit cohesion. During downtime, she isolates herself instead of bonding with fellow soldiers. And during training, she performs exercises with what appears to be minimal effort, while still achieving results that make others look inadequate." Corporal Nathan Phillips, a stocky soldier with arms covered in military tattoos, had drifted over from a nearby table. "Sir, if I may add something, Reeves' performance suggests she's not being challenged by our training regimen. That either means she's not being pushed hard enough or she doesn't take the training seriously. And there's the question of her background," added Private Tyler Johnson, a young soldier whose eagerness to prove himself often led to overstatement. "None of us know what qualifies her for this program. That lack of transparency creates distrust among the ranks." Crawford absorbed their complaints with the expression of someone carefully considering multiple perspectives. In reality, he was calculating the political advantage of addressing a problem that was already generating discussion among the soldiers. Taking action against Sophia would demonstrate his willingness to maintain standards regardless of whatever connection she might have. It would also eliminate a source of uncertainty that had been bothering him since her arrival. "Your concerns are noted," Crawford said with the gravity of someone making an important decision. "Unit cohesion is essential for mission success, and any factor that undermines that cohesion needs to be addressed promptly and decisively." He paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle over the expanding group of listeners. "I'll be conducting a comprehensive evaluation of all personnel to ensure everyone meets the standards expected at this facility. That includes assessment of both skill and attitude." The soldiers around him nodded approvingly, satisfied that their complaints were being taken seriously by someone with the authority to implement solutions. Crawford had successfully positioned himself as the decisive leader, addressing legitimate concerns rather than someone looking for an excuse to target a soldier whose presence made him uncomfortable. Victoria continued eating her breakfast, apparently oblivious to the conversation happening 3 tables away. But her training had taught her to process multiple conversations simultaneously while maintaining the appearance of disinterest. She heard every word, cataloged every speaker, and noted the way Crawford was using legitimate command concerns to mask what appeared to be a personal agenda. She had encountered officers like Crawford before, competent enough to advance through standard military hierarchies, but lacking the intuitive leadership skills required for situations where protocols didn't provide clear guidance. Such officers typically compensated for their limitations by adhering rigidly to regulations and viewing any deviation from standard procedures as a threat to their authority. The problem was that Sophia's very existence represented a deviation from standard procedures. Her background couldn't be explained through normal channels. Her skills exceeded the baseline expectations for soldiers at her apparent rank, and her behavior didn't conform to the social dynamics that Crawford understood and felt comfortable managing. As she finished her meal and prepared to leave for morning training exercises, Sophia recognized the signs of escalating tension that preceded most conflicts. Crawford had positioned himself as the protector of unit standards. Mason had established herself as the voice of legitimate soldier concerns, and the growing group of supporters had created an audience that would expect some form of resolution. The careful balance she had maintained for 5 weeks was beginning to shift, and Sophia understood that the time for passive observation might be coming to an end. Soon, very soon, someone would push hard enough to force her to respond with something more than silent competence. The morning sun promised another day of brutal Arizona heat, and Sophia sensed that today would test more than just physical endurance. Today felt like the day when questions would demand answers, and answers would change everything. The weapons maintenance facility at Fort Daniels existed in a state of organized chaos that would have overwhelmed civilian observers, but felt like home to career soldiers. Rows of disassembled rifles lay on metal tables like mechanical puzzles waiting to be solved, their components sorted with military precision into labeled containers. The air smelled of gun oil and metal cleaner, punctuated by the rhythmic sounds of soldiers working with the focused attention that only came from knowing their lives might depend on the reliability of the weapons they maintained. Sophia occupied a corner workstation where she had been systematically cleaning and reassembling an M4 carbine with movements so fluid they appeared choreographed. Her hands moved independently of conscious thought, muscle memory, guiding her through procedures she had performed thousands of times under conditions ranging from comfortable workshops to muddy foxholes in hostile territory. Each component was inspected, cleaned, and replaced with the kind of thorough attention that separated professionals from amateurs. What distinguished Sophia's work wasn't speed, though she completed tasks faster than most soldiers, but the unconscious competence that marked someone who had moved far beyond basic proficiency into mastery. She didn't need to think about proper trigger assembly or bolt carrier maintenance any more than she needed to think about breathing. Her fingers found worn spots that indicated potential failure points, detected minor imperfections that could cause malfunctions, and made adjustments with the precision of someone whose survival had once depended on such details. The other soldiers in the facility had grown accustomed to stealing glances at her workstation, partly from professional curiosity and partly from the uncomfortable recognition that they were witnessing a level of expertise that made their own skills seem elementary. Sophia never acknowledged their attention, never offered advice or criticism, never engaged in the casual conversations that typically develop between soldiers working on similar tasks. Instead, she maintained the same detached focus that characterized all her activities at Fort Daniels. Private Tyler Johnson worked at the station adjacent to Sophia's, struggling with a stubborn bolt assembly that refused to seat properly despite repeated attempts. His frustration was evident in the increasingly aggressive way he handled the components, his movements becoming jerky and impatient as the mechanism continued to resist his efforts. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the air conditioning, and his breathing had taken on the shallow quality that indicated rising stress levels. Sophia watched Johnson struggle through her peripheral vision while continuing her own work with uninterrupted efficiency. She could see the problem immediately, a minor warping in one of the internal components that was preventing proper alignment, and could have solved it in 30 seconds with the right technique. But offering help would require breaking the careful social distance she had maintained for 5 weeks, and Sophia wasn't ready to abandon that strategic position over a maintenance issue that Johnson would eventually solve through persistence, if not skill. What she didn't anticipate was how her apparent indifference would be interpreted by soldiers who were already predisposed to view her with suspicion. "You know," Johnson said, his voice pitched loudly enough to carry beyond their immediate area, "most soldiers would offer to help when they see a fellow service member struggling with equipment maintenance." Sophia's hands never paused in their work. Her expression never changed, and her eyes never shifted from the weapon components in front of her. She simply continued reassembling her rifle with the same steady precision that had characterized her movement since arriving at the facility. Johnson's comment drew attention from neighboring workstations, creating an audience for what was clearly intended as a public challenge to Sophia's behavior. Soldiers paused their own work to observe the interaction, sensing the potential for conflict, with the instinctive awareness that military personnel develop for social tensions. Corporal Nathan Phillips looked up from his own workstation with the expression of someone who had been waiting for exactly this kind of opportunity. "That's what I've been talking about," he said, his voice carrying the satisfaction of someone whose suspicions were being confirmed. "Zero team spirit, zero interest in helping fellow soldiers succeed." The criticism struck a nerve with several soldiers who had been struggling with various aspects of the advanced training program. Sophia's consistent competence made their own difficulties feel more pronounced, and her refusal to offer guidance or encouragement created the impression that she considered herself above such concerns. Sergeant Rebecca Mason emerged from the armory office where she had been reviewing maintenance schedules with one of the facility supervisors. Her timing was perfect, or perhaps she had been monitoring the situation from a distance, waiting for the right moment to insert herself into the developing conflict. "This is exactly what I was discussing with Captain Crawford." Mason announced, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had already identified the problem and was prepared to address it decisively. "We're supposed to be building unit cohesion through shared challenges and mutual support. But how can we function as a team when some members refuse to participate in the collaborative aspects of military service?" Sophia finally looked up from her workstation, her eyes tracking from Johnson to Phillips to Mason with the kind of methodical assessment that suggested she was cataloging threats rather than engaging in social interaction. The silence stretched out uncomfortably as soldiers waited for her to defend herself, explain her behavior, or at least acknowledge the criticisms being leveled against her. Instead, Sophia set down her cleaning tools with the same precise movements that characterized everything she did and reached for the small notebook she kept secured in her cargo pocket. She opened it to a page filled with dense handwriting and began making additional notes, her pen moving steadily across the paper, as if the conversation around her was simply another piece of information to be documented and filed away. The gesture was so dismissive, so completely indifferent to their complaints, that it sparked something deeper than mere frustration among the soldiers watching. This wasn't just antisocial behavior. It was active contempt for their concerns, their authority, and their presence. "Are you seriously taking notes right now?" Johnson asked, his voice rising with incredulity. "We're trying to have a conversation about unit dynamics, and you're treating it like some kind of research project." Sophia continued writing without looking up, her handwriting, maintaining the same small, precise characters that had frustrated curious observers since her arrival. Whatever she was documenting required careful attention to detail because she made several corrections and additions before finally closing the notebook and securing it back in her pocket. When she resumed work on her rifle, her movements carried the same fluid competence they always had, as if the entire confrontation had been nothing more than background noise requiring no response or acknowledgement. The message was clear. Their opinions didn't matter to her. Their criticism carried no weight, and their presence was barely worth noticing. Mason's face flushed with the kind of anger that came from being ignored rather than opposed. Soldiers could handle disagreement, argument, even direct confrontation. But being dismissed as irrelevant struck at the core of military identity, which was built on the principle that every service member mattered and deserved respect from their peers. "This ends today," Mason said, her voice carrying the finality of someone who had reached the limits of patience. "I'm documenting this behavior and forwarding it through proper channels. Captain Crawford needs to know that we have a soldier who refuses to function as part of a team." Phillips nodded approvingly. "Someone needs to explain to Reeves that military service isn't a solo career path. We succeed or fail together, and anyone who can't understand that doesn't belong here." The facility had grown quieter as more soldiers stopped their work to observe the confrontation. Sophia had become the focal point of attention. Without speaking a word, her silence creating a vacuum that others felt compelled to fill with increasingly pointed criticisms and demands for response. But Sophia simply continued working her hands, moving through familiar maintenance procedures, while her mind processed the escalating social dynamics around her. She had faced hostile interrogations by enemy operatives who were trained in psychological manipulation. She had endured weeks of isolation in environments designed to break mental resistance. A group of frustrated soldiers expressing their disapproval was barely worth registering as a stressor. What concerned her wasn't their anger. It was the way that anger was being channeled into formal complaints that would inevitably reach officers looking for excuses to demonstrate their authority. Sophia recognized the signs of a situation that was moving beyond informal social pressure into the realm of official military discipline. The careful balance she had maintained for 5 weeks was finally beginning to collapse, and Sophia understood that the time for passive observation was rapidly coming to an end. Soon she would need to choose between maintaining her cover and defending herself through methods that would raise uncomfortable questions about her background. As she completed the final reassembly of her rifle and began the post-maintenance inspection that would verify its readiness for service, Sophia allowed herself a moment to consider the irony of her situation. The soldiers questioning her dedication had never been tested under conditions where failure meant death. They had never carried the weight of impossible decisions or lived with the consequences of tactical choices that saved some lives while sacrificing others. But they would learn. Very soon they would all learn exactly who Sophia Reeves really was and why her silence had been the greatest kindness she could offer them. The morning briefing room at Fort Daniels buzzed with nervous energy as soldiers filed in for what had been announced as a special evaluation session. Captain James Crawford stood at the front of the room, his uniform pressed to razor-sharp perfection, studying a clipboard with the intense focus of someone preparing to make important decisions. Behind him, a large screen displayed the day's training schedule, but the specifics remained hidden under a cover slide that simply read, "Performance Assessment, All Personnel." Sophia entered the room with her characteristic economy of motion, selecting a seat in the back row, where she could observe the entire gathering without drawing attention to herself. Her leather journal rested in her lap, ready for the detailed observations she had been making since her arrival at the base. Something about the energy in the room felt different today. More charged, more purposeful, as if invisible currents were building toward an inevitable storm. Sergeant Rebecca Mason positioned herself in the third row, surrounded by the coalition of soldiers who had become her unofficial supporters over the past week. Their whispered conversations and pointed glances in Sophia's direction made it clear that today's session was connected to their ongoing campaign to address what they perceived as a fundamental problem with unit cohesion. Mason's body language radiated the satisfaction of someone who had successfully escalated an issue through proper channels and was about to witness the results of her initiative. Crawford called the room to attention with the crisp authority that had characterized his leadership style since taking command of the advanced training program. 200 soldiers snapped to their feet in unison, the sound of their movement echoing off concrete walls decorated with inspirational quotes about courage, honor, and sacrifice. When they settled back into their seats, the silence was absolute, the kind of focused quiet that indicated everyone understood they were about to witness something significant. "Ladies and gentlemen," Crawford began, his voice carrying the measured cadence of someone who had rehearsed his remarks carefully. "This facility exists to prepare elite soldiers for the most challenging assignments our military faces. That preparation requires not only individual excellence, but also the ability to function effectively as part of a coordinated team." He paused, allowing his words to settle over the assembled soldiers like a declaration of principles that would guide whatever came next. Over the past several weeks, concerns have been raised about unit cohesion and the collaborative spirit that forms the foundation of military effectiveness. These concerns have been brought to my attention through proper channels, and they require immediate address. Sophia's pen moved steadily across the pages of her journal, documenting not just Crawford's words, but the reactions they generated throughout the room. She noted the way certain soldiers shifted uncomfortably when he mentioned concerns about collaboration, the way others nodded approvingly when he emphasized the importance of team function, and the way Mason's group exchanged satisfied glances when he referenced issues being raised through proper channels. What interested Sophia most was Crawford's body language, the slight tension in his shoulders that suggested he was operating outside his normal comfort zone, the way his eyes avoided certain sections of the room while speaking, and the careful precision of his word choices that indicated he was following a script rather than speaking from personal conviction. This wasn't a commander addressing legitimate training concerns. This was an officer who had been maneuvered into taking action that served someone else's agenda. Military service, Crawford continued, his voice gaining strength as he moved into familiar territory, is fundamentally about sacrifice. Not just the willingness to sacrifice your life for your country, but the daily sacrifice of individual preferences for the greater good of the unit. Soldiers who cannot or will not make that sacrifice represent a threat to mission success and the safety of their fellow service members. The room remained silent, but Sophia could sense the shifting energy as soldiers began to understand that this briefing wasn't theoretical. Someone specific was being targeted, and most of them had a good idea who that someone might be. Conversations over the past week had centered increasingly on Sophia's isolation, her mysterious background, and her apparent indifference to the social dynamics that bound military units together. Crawford's eyes swept the room with practiced authority, making eye contact with soldiers throughout the assembled group before finally settling on Sophia's position in the back row. Today's evaluation will test not only individual competence, but also the willingness to demonstrate the collaborative spirit that separates true soldiers from individuals who happen to wear uniforms. The words hung in the air like a challenge, and Sophia understood that the careful neutrality she had maintained for 5 weeks was about to be tested in ways that might force her to abandon the protective anonymity she had cultivated. Crawford wasn't just announcing a training exercise. He was setting the stage for a confrontation that would determine whether she could continue operating under the radar or would be forced to reveal capabilities that raised uncomfortable questions about her background. Behind Crawford, the screen flickered to life, revealing a detailed training scenario that made several soldiers lean forward with interest. The exercise involved a simulated hostage rescue operation in an urban environment complete with multiple entry points, civilian complications, and time constraints that would test decision-making under extreme pressure. Teams of 4 soldiers would be assigned, randomly given 30 minutes to develop tactical plans, and then evaluated on both the quality of their strategies and their ability to function cohesively during the planning process. Team assignments are posted on the board outside, Crawford announced, gesturing toward the exit. You have exactly 30 minutes to develop your approach before presenting to the evaluation panel. Your success will be measured not only on tactical soundness, but on your ability to incorporate input from all team members and demonstrate the collaborative decision-making that characterizes effective military units. Sophia closed her journal and secured it in her cargo pocket, recognizing that the time for passive observation was rapidly coming to an end. The evaluation was clearly designed to test her willingness to engage with other soldiers in the kind of collaborative planning that she had avoided since arriving at Fort Daniels. Crawford and Mason had maneuvered her into a situation where continued isolation would be interpreted as evidence of the antisocial behavior they had been documenting. As soldiers began filing out of the briefing room to check team assignments, Sophia caught fragments of conversations that confirmed her assessment of the situation. Finally going to see what Reeves is really made of, someone whispered. About time someone tested whether she can actually work with a team, another voice added. The anticipation was palpable. Soldiers who had been frustrated by her mysterious competence were eager to see her forced into a situation where that competence would have to be demonstrated through conventional military cooperation. Sophia approached the assignment board with the same measured stride that characterized all her movements. But internally, she was calculating options with the rapid-fire analysis that had kept her alive during missions where hesitation meant death. She could participate fully in the exercise, demonstrating the collaborative skills that would satisfy Crawford's evaluation criteria while maintaining the appearance of someone learning to function better within military social structures. Or she could continue her pattern of minimal engagement, accepting whatever consequences Crawford chose to impose, while preserving the anonymity that protected her from questions she wasn't ready to answer. The third option, the one that worried her most, was that the exercise itself might force her to reveal tactical knowledge that went far beyond what any soldier at her apparent level should possess. Urban hostage rescue operations were exactly the kind of mission that Desert Talon operatives had trained for extensively, and Sophia's expertise in such scenarios was both comprehensive and impossible to disguise if she chose to apply it fully. Her name appeared on the board alongside 3 other soldiers, Corporal Nathan Phillips, Private Tyler Johnson, and Specialist Jennifer Martinez. The team composition wasn't random. It was a carefully constructed test that paired her with 3 of the soldiers who had been most vocal in their criticism of her behavior. Phillips and Johnson had directly confronted her during the weapons maintenance incident, while Martinez had been part of Mason's group during several mess hall conversations about Sophia's unsuitability for the program. Sophia studied the names with professional detachment, recognizing that Crawford had created a scenario designed to maximize tension while providing clear metrics for evaluating her response to adversarial team dynamics. If she failed to contribute meaningfully to the planning process, it would confirm allegations about her unwillingness to collaborate. If she dominated the planning process, it would suggest arrogance and disrespect for her teammates' capabilities. And if she demonstrated knowledge that exceeded reasonable expectations for her background, it would raise questions that could unravel the careful cover story that protected her true identity. As she walked toward the designated planning area where her team was already gathering, Sophia realized that 5 weeks of careful neutrality had led inevitably to this moment of forced choice. The storm that had been building since her arrival at Fort Daniels was about to break, and she would have to decide whether to weather it as Sophia Reeves, the mysterious soldier with an unknown background, or as someone else entirely. Someone whose existence would change everything the people around her thought they understood about military capability and the true nature of the threats their country faced. The next 30 minutes would determine not just her future at Fort Daniels, but whether the secret she had carried for 3 years would finally be exposed to people who had no idea they were about to witness the tactical expertise of someone who had already proven herself in ways they could barely imagine. The tactical planning room felt smaller, with tension radiating from all corners, where Sophia's assigned teammates had positioned themselves like opposing forces rather than collaborators. Corporal Nathan Phillips dominated the central table space, spreading out building schematics and tactical diagrams with the aggressive confidence of someone who assumed leadership by default. His muscular frame and collection of military tattoos projected an image of competence that had served him well throughout his career. But his approach to the hostage rescue scenario revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of urban warfare complexities. Private Tyler Johnson paced along the far wall, his nervous energy manifesting in constant movement as he studied the mission parameters with growing frustration. At 22, he possessed the kind of eager intensity that marks soldiers trying to prove themselves worthy of elite assignments. But his suggestions carried the theoretical quality of someone whose combat experience came primarily from training exercises rather than real-world applications. Specialist Jennifer Martinez occupied the corner nearest the door, her arms crossed and her expression radiating skepticism about the entire process. As a communications specialist with 3 years of field experience, she had developed strong opinions about tactical planning and wasn't shy about expressing them when she disagreed with proposed strategies. Her presence added another layer of complexity to group dynamics that were already strained by underlying hostilities. Sophia sat quietly at the edge of the planning table, her notebook open to a fresh page, observing the chaotic brainstorming session with the detached interest of someone watching a training exercise she had seen performed many times before. Phillips had immediately assumed command of the planning process, his voice growing louder with each tactical suggestion as he attempted to establish dominance through volume and certainty. His approach to the hostage scenario relied heavily on overwhelming force and rapid execution tactics that might work in open combat situations, but could prove disastrous in the confined spaces and civilian complications that characterized urban rescue operations. "We go in hard and fast," Phillips declared, stabbing at the building schematic with his finger. "Two-man breach team through the front entrance, while the other two provide overwatch and secure the perimeter. Speed and aggression are our primary assets here." Johnson nodded enthusiastically, drawn to the simplicity and decisiveness of Phillips's plan. "Exactly. The longer we wait, the more time the hostage takers have to adapt or relocate. Strike fast, strike hard, minimize their reaction time." Martinez shook her head with the exasperation of someone listening to dangerous oversimplification. "You're treating this like a standard building clearing operation, but we've got civilian hostages whose safety is the primary mission objective, unknown numbers of hostile forces, and multiple potential escape routes that aren't accounted for in your frontal assault strategy." The criticism sparked immediate defensiveness from Phillips, whose leadership style didn't accommodate challenges to his tactical decisions. "Look, Martinez, I've been doing this longer than you have. Sometimes the direct approach is the most effective approach. Complicated plans create more opportunities for things to go wrong. And simple plans create opportunities for hostages to get killed when you breach through the front door without proper intelligence about interior layouts, hostile positions, or civilian locations." Martinez replied, her voice carrying the sharp edge of someone whose patience was wearing thin. Sophia continued making notes in her journal, documenting not just the tactical discussion, but the interpersonal dynamics that were undermining any possibility of effective collaboration. Phillips's need to dominate the planning process was preventing him from considering alternative perspectives, while Johnson's eagerness to support the most aggressive option suggested he was prioritizing social acceptance over tactical soundness. Martinez possessed the most realistic assessment of the scenario's complexities, but her combative approach to disagreement was alienating potential allies rather than building consensus around better strategies. What none of them realized was that Sophia had participated in 7 actual hostage rescue operations during her time with Desert Talon, including 3 in urban environments that closely resembled the current training scenario. She could see at least 4 critical flaws in Phillips's proposed approach, 3 alternative entry strategies that would minimize civilian casualties, and 2 contingency plans that would be essential if the primary assault encountered unexpected resistance. But revealing that knowledge would require explanations about her background that she wasn't prepared to provide. "What about you, Reeves?" Phillips suddenly demanded, his attention shifting to Sophia with the aggressive focus of someone looking for validation rather than input. "You've been sitting there taking notes like you're writing a book report. Do you have any actual tactical suggestions, or are you just documenting our planning process for whatever mysterious purpose you use that journal for?" The challenge was direct and public, delivered in a tone that made it clear Phillips expected either submission or conflict, rather than genuine collaboration. The room fell silent as Johnson and Martinez turned their attention to Sophia, curious about how she would respond to direct confrontation. After weeks of avoiding such interactions, Sophia looked up from her journal with the calm expression that had frustrated so many soldiers since her arrival at Fort Daniels. "I think your approach has merit," she said carefully, "but it might benefit from considering additional variables that could affect mission success." Phillips leaned back in his chair with the satisfaction of someone whose authority had been acknowledged. "Finally, some recognition that experience matters. What specific variables are you thinking about?" "Structural considerations," Sophia replied, pointing to sections of the building schematic that Phillips had dismissed as irrelevant. "These windows face east, which means afternoon sun will create visibility challenges for anyone positioned outside. The main entrance opens directly into what appears to be a lobby area, with multiple sightlines making it a natural kill zone if hostiles are expecting assault through that route." Her observations were delivered in the same neutral tone she used for all communications, but the tactical sophistication they revealed made all 3 teammates look at her with new attention. This wasn't the theoretical knowledge that came from classroom instruction. These were practical considerations that suggested real-world experience with similar scenarios. Johnson stepped closer to the table, his curiosity overriding his previous hostility. "Okay, so what would you suggest instead?" Sophia hesitated, recognizing that any detailed tactical recommendation would reveal knowledge that went far beyond what someone with her apparent background should possess. But the directness of the question made continued evasion impossible without appearing incompetent or uncooperative. "Multiple entry points," she said finally. "Small teams entering simultaneously from different vectors to divide hostile attention and create confusion about the primary assault direction. Use the structural features to your advantage rather than fighting against them." Martinez nodded slowly, her expression shifting from skepticism to professional interest. "That makes sense. Create multiple threats that force the hostiles to divide their defensive focus instead of concentrating fire on a single breach point." "Exactly," Sophia confirmed, then immediately regretted providing confirmation that suggested familiarity with advanced tactical concepts. Phillips studied the schematics with growing frustration, recognizing that Sophia's suggestions were tactically superior to his own, but unwilling to concede leadership to someone whose authority he didn't recognize. Multiple entry points require coordination and timing that could easily go wrong. Simple plans work because they're harder to mess up. Simple plans also work because they're easier for enemies to predict and counter. Sophia replied, her voice remaining steady despite the increasing tension in the room. The exchange had shifted from collaborative planning into something resembling a tactical debate between competing philosophies, with Sophia inadvertently revealing expertise that raised questions about her background, while Philip struggled to maintain authority that was being undermined by her superior knowledge. Johnson and Martinez watched the developing conflict with the fascination of spectators at a sporting event, sensing that they were witnessing something more significant than a simple disagreement about mission planning. The quiet soldier who had been dismissed as antisocial and unqualified was demonstrating tactical sophistication that exceeded anything they had expected, while the confident leader who had assumed command was beginning to look outmatched by someone he had underestimated. The timer on the wall showed 15 minutes remaining in their planning session, but Sophia realized that the real countdown had nothing to do with the training exercise. She was approaching the point where continued concealment would require her to advocate for inferior tactics that could theoretically result in unnecessary casualties, while revealing her true capabilities would expose the carefully maintained cover that had protected her identity for 5 weeks. The storm that had been building since her arrival at Fort Daniels was finally beginning to break, and Sophia understood that the next 15 minutes would determine whether she could weather it as the mysterious soldier with an unknown background, or whether she would be forced to become someone else entirely, someone whose existence would shatter every assumption her teammates had made about military competence and the true nature of the threats their country faced. The main training field at Fort Daniels stretched across several acres of desert sand, its perimeter marked by equipment sheds and observation towers that cast long shadows in the afternoon sun. Captain James Crawford had positioned himself at a raised platform overlooking the exercise area, flanked by a panel of senior instructors whose clipboards and stopwatches indicated they were prepared to evaluate every aspect of the upcoming tactical demonstrations. Behind them, nearly 300 soldiers had gathered to observe the hostage rescue scenarios, their conversations creating a steady buzz of anticipation that suggested word had spread about the true purpose of today's evaluation. Sophia's team approached their designated starting position with the kind of tense energy that preceded most conflicts. The planning session had concluded without resolution, leaving them with a compromised strategy that satisfied no one and incorporated tactical elements that Sophia knew were fundamentally flawed. Phillips had insisted on maintaining command authority, despite the growing evidence that his approach to urban warfare was dangerously outdated, while Martinez and Johnson had aligned themselves with different aspects of Sophia's suggestions without fully understanding their strategic implications. The result was a tactical plan that attempted to combine aggressive frontal assault with coordinated multiple entry points, creating a hybrid approach that maximized risk while minimizing the advantages that either strategy might have offered independently. Sophia had tried to explain the contradictions inherent in their compromise, but Phillips had dismissed her concerns as theoretical overthinking that would paralyze them during execution. Crawford's voice carried across the training field through speakers mounted on the observation towers, his words reaching every soldier gathered to witness the evaluation. Team 4, you are cleared to begin your tactical demonstration. You have 12 minutes to complete the hostage rescue scenario using the strategy developed during your planning session. Your performance will be evaluated on tactical soundness, execution efficiency, and collaborative effectiveness. The mock building that served as their target was a 3-story concrete structure designed to simulate urban residential complexes where terrorist organizations frequently establish operational bases. Windows had been equipped with sensors that would register simulated weapons fire, while motion detectors throughout the interior would track team movements and measure response times to the various tactical developments. Automated systems would introduce complications during the exercise, sudden changes in hostage locations, additional hostile forces, equipment failures that would test the team's ability to adapt under pressure. Sophia studied the building with professional assessment, her eyes automatically cataloging structural features that would affect tactical options, load-bearing walls that couldn't be breached safely, sight lines that would expose assault teams to defensive fire, and architectural elements that could provide either cover or concealment depending on how they were utilized. Her training with Desert Talon had involved extensive practice in similar facilities, and she could see immediately that the compromise strategy they had developed would encounter problems within the first 3 minutes of execution. Phillips positioned himself at the primary breach point, checking his equipment with the focused intensity of someone determined to prove his leadership capabilities through decisive action. His M4 carbine was configured for close quarters combat, equipped with tactical lights and laser sights that would provide advantages in the building's darkened interior. Johnson flanked him at the secondary entry point, his nervous energy now channeled into hyper-vigilant attention to detail as he prepared for what he clearly viewed as a test of his worthiness for continued participation in the advanced training program. Martinez had taken position at the communication station, where she would coordinate team movements and relay information about tactical developments as they emerged during the exercise. Her equipment included radio systems, building monitoring displays, and direct communication links to the evaluation panel that would allow real-time assessment of decision-making processes under stress. Sophia found herself assigned to overwatch position on a nearby building equipped with a designated marksman rifle and tasked with providing covering fire for the assault teams while identifying threats that might emerge from unexpected directions. The position was strategically sound but tactically limiting. She would be able to observe the entire operation, but unable to directly influence its execution when problems inevitably developed. As the countdown timer reached its final seconds, Sophia recognized that she was about to witness a tactical disaster that would likely result in simulated casualties among both hostages and assault team members. The compromise strategy they had developed contained fundamental flaws that would become apparent as soon as they attempted implementation, but her warnings had been dismissed as theoretical concerns that didn't apply to practical military operations. The exercise began with Phillips initiating his frontal assault exactly as planned, his approach confident and aggressive as he breached the primary entrance with textbook precision. Johnson simultaneously entered through the secondary access point, his movements coordinated with Phillips through radio communication that Martinez monitored from her command position. For the first 60 seconds, their execution appeared flawless, a demonstration of military competence that drew approving nods from the evaluation panel. Then the complications began. Automated systems introduced the first tactical variable, additional hostile forces positioned in locations that hadn't been anticipated during planning. Phillips found himself pinned down in the main corridor by defensive fire from multiple directions, while Johnson discovered that his assigned route was blocked by structural debris that required immediate tactical adaptation. Martinez attempted to coordinate their responses from her communication station, but the rapid changes in tactical circumstances exceeded their planning assumptions. Sophia watched the developing crisis through her rifle scope, recognizing each problem as it emerged, and calculating solutions with the rapid-fire analysis that had kept Desert Talon operatives alive during actual combat operations. She could see exactly what needed to happen. Phillips needed to withdraw from his exposed position and approach from a different vector. Johnson needed to bypass the blocked route using alternative access points that existed but hadn't been identified during planning. And Martinez needed to redirect their coordination based on real-time tactical intelligence rather than predetermined assumptions. But providing that guidance would require revealing knowledge that went far beyond what any soldier at her apparent level should possess. Through her radio headset, Sophia could hear the growing frustration in her teammates' voices as they struggled to adapt their compromise strategy to tactical realities that were overwhelming their planning assumptions. Phillips was requesting backup that didn't exist. Johnson was asking for routing guidance that Martinez couldn't provide. And Martinez was trying to coordinate responses to situations that exceeded her training and tactical command experience. The timer showed 8 minutes remaining, but Sophia could see that their current approach would result in mission failure within the next 2 minutes unless someone provided tactical guidance that salvaged their deteriorating position. She keyed her radio with the calm professionalism that had characterized her communication style since arriving at Fort Daniels. Overwatch to assault teams, recommend immediate tactical adjustment based on current hostile positions. Phillips' response crackled through her headset with barely controlled anger. Out of Overwatch, maintain position and provide covering fire as assigned. We've got this handled. But they didn't have it handled, and Sophia could see their tactical situation deteriorating with each passing second. In 90 seconds, the automated systems would introduce additional complications that would turn their current difficulties into complete mission failure. Simulated hostages would be declared dead. Assault team members would be marked as casualties, and their performance evaluation would reflect tactical incompetence that could affect their military careers. Sophia faced the choice she had been avoiding for 5 weeks. Watch her teammates fail because of tactical decisions she knew were wrong, or reveal an awe of expertise to guide them towards success, while risking exposure of capabilities that would raise uncomfortable questions about her background. Through the scope of her rifle, Sophia tracked movement within the mock building as Phillips attempted to advance through a corridor that she knew was a tactical trap. In 30 seconds, he would be in a position where defensive fire would simulate fatal wounds, unless someone warned him about the threat he couldn't see. Sophia's finger hovered over her radio transmission key, and she realized that 5 weeks of careful anonymity were about to end with a single decision that would change everything. The people around her thought they understood about military competence and the true nature of the soldier who had been hiding among them. The next 30 seconds unfolded with the kind of clarity that Sophia had experienced during actual combat operations, where time seemed to slow and every detail became hyper-focused, while her mind processed tactical information at speeds that exceeded conscious thought. Through her rifle scope, she watched Phillips advance into the corridor trap with the confident stride of someone who believed his military training had prepared him for any situation he might encounter. But Sophia could see what Phillips couldn't. Motion sensors had detected movement in adjacent rooms that indicated hostile forces positioning themselves for a coordinated ambush. In 15 seconds, Phillips would reach the intersection where multiple firing angles would converge on his position. The automated training system would register simulated wounds that would remove him from the exercise while marking his tactical approach as fatally flawed. Martinez's voice crackled through the radio with growing urgency as she monitored the building sensor systems from her command position. Phillips, I'm reading multiple contacts in your vicinity. Recommend you hold position while we assess the tactical situation. Phillips's response carried the aggressive certainty of someone who had committed to a course of action and refused to acknowledge complications that might require adaptation. Negative, we're moving forward according to plan. Johnson, maintain your advance through the secondary corridor and prepare to converge on the target area. Sophia's training with Desert Talon had included extensive practice in making split-second decisions under pressure when the lives of team members depended on immediate action. She had learned to calculate risk factors, tactical alternatives, and probable outcomes in the compressed timeframes that characterize combat operations where hesitation meant death. The current situation wasn't life or death, but the principles remained the same. Someone with superior tactical knowledge faced the choice of watching preventable failure occur or intervening with expertise that would raise uncomfortable questions. She keyed her radio transmission with the calm authority that had once coordinated operations across multiple continents under conditions where mission success determined national security outcomes. All units halt advance immediately. Phillips, you have hostile forces positioned at bearing 270 and 315 degrees from your current position. Johnson, your route is compromised. You need to adjust to alternative access point Charlie 3. The certainty in Sophia's voice carried weight that went beyond normal military communication protocols. This wasn't a suggestion or recommendation. It was tactical intelligence delivered with the precision of someone who could see patterns that others missed and calculate solutions that others couldn't imagine. Phillips stopped his advance, his confusion evident in the sudden silence that followed Sophia's transmission. Through her scope, she could see him checking his position against the building schematic, while trying to understand how an overwatch position could provide detailed intelligence about interior tactical developments. Reeves, how do you have visibility on interior hostile positions from your current location? Martinez asked, her professional curiosity overriding protocol as she tried to understand tactical information that exceeded the capabilities of standard Overwatch procedures. Sophia realized that any detailed explanation would reveal reconnaissance techniques that went far beyond conventional military training. But Phillips was still positioned in the kill zone, and Johnson was approaching a corridor that would expose him to concentrated defensive fire within the next minute. Structural analysis combined with sensor pattern recognition, Sophia replied, hoping that technical explanation would satisfy immediate questions while providing the tactical guidance they needed. Phillips moved to cover position at the northeast stairwell and approached the target area from above. Johnson bypassed the blocked corridor and used the maintenance access on the building's west side. Her instructions were delivered with military precision, but they revealed knowledge of the building's internal layout that went beyond what anyone should have possessed based on the limited schematics provided during planning. Sophia was drawing on experience with similar structures during actual operations, unconsciously applying tactical knowledge that she had gained through missions that officially didn't exist. Phillips began moving toward the position. Sophia had identified his confusion about her intelligence sources, overridden by recognition that her tactical assessment was proving accurate. The hostile forces that had been preparing to ambush his original route were indeed positioned exactly where she had indicated, and the alternative approach she suggested would avoid their prepared defensive positions. Johnson adjusted his route according to Sophia's guidance, discovering that the maintenance access she had identified provided exactly the kind of concealed approach that their compromised strategy had failed to incorporate. His movement through the alternative route was swift and efficient, demonstrating the kind of tactical adaptation that separated competent soldiers from exceptional ones. From her command position, Martinez monitored their progress with professional appreciation for tactical coordination that exceeded anything she had witnessed during previous training exercises. Reeves, your intelligence is proving incredibly accurate. How are you generating such detailed tactical assessment from Overwatch position? The question hung in the desert air like a challenge that Sophia couldn't deflect, without revealing capabilities that would expose her true background. She was providing tactical guidance with a level of sophistication that suggested experience with actual combat operations, knowledge of advanced reconnaissance techniques, and familiarity with urban warfare scenarios that went far beyond standard military training. Through her rifle scope, Sophia watched Phillips successfully reach the elevated position she had recommended, his tactical situation now vastly improved compared to the trap he had been approaching. Johnson's flanking movement through the maintenance access was proceeding without detection, positioning him for the kind of coordinated assault that might actually succeed in completing the hostage rescue objective. But the evaluation panel was taking notes with renewed intensity, their attention focused on the dramatic improvement in tactical effectiveness that had resulted from Sophia's intervention. Captain Crawford stood at his observation platform with an expression that suggested he was witnessing something that didn't fit his understanding of the soldiers under his command. Sophia's radio crackled with Martinez's voice now carrying a tone of professional respect that hadn't been present during their planning session. All units, we have successful tactical repositioning based on Overwatch intelligence. Phillips and Johnson are in position for coordinated final assault on target area. The timer showed 4 minutes remaining, and their tactical situation had been transformed from impending failure into probable success through Sophia's guidance. But the cost of that success was the exposure of expertise that raised fundamental questions about her background training and the true nature of her assignment to Fort Daniels. Crawford's voice echoed across the training field through the speaker system, carrying authority that suggested he was prepared to address the situation that was developing beyond his original evaluation parameters. Team 4 halt exercise. All personnel report to the evaluation platform immediately for tactical debrief. Sophia understood that the careful anonymity she had maintained for 5 weeks was about to be subjected to scrutiny that would either expose her true identity or force her to provide explanations that were impossible to reconcile with her official background. The mask she had worn since arriving at Fort Daniels was beginning to slip, and she wasn't certain she could prevent it from falling away completely. As she secured her equipment and prepared to descend from her Overwatch position, Sophia realized that the storm she had been anticipating was finally breaking over Fort Daniels with a force that would change everything. The quiet soldier who had been dismissed as antisocial and unqualified was about to face questions that would determine whether she could continue operating under the protective cover of anonymity or whether the truth about Operation Desert Talon would finally emerge from the shadows where it had been hidden for 3 years. The next few minutes would determine not just her future at the base, but whether the most classified military operation in recent history would be exposed to people who had no security clearance to know it had ever existed. The evaluation platform at Fort Daniels commanded a view of the entire training complex, its elevated position allowing instructors to observe multiple exercises simultaneously while maintaining communication with field commanders across the base. Captain James Crawford stood at the center of the platform with the rigid posture of someone who had encountered a situation that challenged his understanding of military protocol, his clipboard forgotten as he focused entirely on the 4 soldiers approaching from the exercise area. Behind Crawford, the panel of senior instructors exhibited the kind of professional curiosity that emerged when routine evaluations produced unexpected results. Sergeant Major Patricia Wells, a 30-year veteran whose experience included deployments to every major conflict zone of the past 3 decades, studied Sophia with the assessment skills that came from evaluating thousands of soldiers under stress. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Hayes, the base's tactical training coordinator, reviewed digital recordings of the exercise with the focused attention of someone trying to understand how a failed mission had been transformed into textbook execution through the intervention of a soldier whose capabilities exceeded all reasonable expectations. Sophia approached the platform with the same measured stride that had characterized her movement since arriving at Fort Daniels. But internally, she was calculating responses to questions that would inevitably probe beyond the surface explanations she had prepared for this moment. Her teammates flanked her with expressions that ranged from confusion to professional respect, their previous hostility replaced by uncertainty about what they had witnessed during the tactical exercise. Phillips looked like someone who had been forced to confront the limitations of his own expertise while recognizing superior knowledge in someone he had dismissed as incompetent. His confidence had been shaken by the realization that Sophia's tactical guidance had prevented what would have been a comprehensive mission failure, and his usual aggressive demeanor had been replaced by the cautious respect that soldiers showed when they encountered capabilities they didn't understand. Johnson's nervous energy had evolved into something approaching awe as he processed the tactical sophistication that Sophia had demonstrated during their coordination. The precision of her intelligence, the accuracy of her route recommendations, and the strategic thinking that had salvaged their compromised mission suggested military experience that went far beyond anything he had imagined possible for someone at her apparent rank. Martinez carried herself with the professional assessment skills of someone trained to analyze communication patterns and information flow under stress. Her expertise in tactical coordination allowed her to recognize that Sophia's guidance had exhibited qualities that were characteristic of Special Operations Command rather than standard military training, and her expression suggested she was drawing conclusions that raised uncomfortable questions about Sophia's true background. Crawford initiated the debrief with the authoritative tone that he used when addressing situations that required immediate clarification. Team 4, your exercise demonstrated remarkable tactical adaptation that resulted in mission success despite initial strategic difficulties. However, the source of that adaptation requires explanation. He paused his attention, focusing specifically on Sophia with the intensity of someone who suspected he was dealing with circumstances that exceeded his normal administrative authority. Soldier Reeves, your tactical guidance during the exercise exhibited knowledge that appears inconsistent with your background and training records. Please explain how you were able to provide detailed intelligence about interior hostile positions from an exterior Overwatch location. Sophia had anticipated this question since the moment she decided to intervene in the tactical exercise, and she had prepared responses that might satisfy immediate curiosity without revealing information that would compromise operational security. But the directness of Crawford's inquiry made it clear that simple explanations would not be sufficient. Sir, I utilized structural analysis combined with pattern recognition based on sensor feedback and tactical probability assessment. Sophia replied, her voice maintaining the neutral professionalism that had frustrated interrogators during previous debriefs. The building's design created predictable defensive positions that could be identified through systematic observation. Sergeant Major Wells stepped forward with the kind of movement that suggested she was prepared to probe beyond surface explanations. Her experience with special operations personnel had taught her to recognize the linguistic patterns that characterized soldiers who had been trained to deflect questions about classified activities. Soldier Reeves and Wells said, her voice carrying authority that came from 3 decades of evaluating military personnel under conditions that revealed their true capabilities. Your tactical guidance exhibited familiarity with advanced reconnaissance techniques and urban warfare strategies that exceed standard training protocols. Where did you acquire that expertise? The question was more sophisticated than Crawford's initial inquiry, demonstrating understanding that Sophia's performance couldn't be explained through conventional military education. Wells was probing for information about specialized training that would account for capabilities that suggested experience with classified operations. Sophia recognized that continued deflection would only intensify scrutiny while failing to provide explanations that satisfied legitimate command concerns about her background. But revealing information about Desert Talon would violate security protocols that were designed to protect both operational methods and the families of personnel whose service records remain classified for national security reasons. Ma'am, my previous assignments included training scenarios that emphasized tactical problem-solving under stress, Sophia replied, hoping that vague references to unspecified training would satisfy immediate questions without providing details that would compromise security protocols. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes approached the questioning from a different angle, his expertise in tactical training allowing him to recognize specific techniques that Sophia had employed during the exercise. Reeves, your route recommendations demonstrated knowledge of building layouts that exceeded the schematic information provided during planning. That suggests either prior familiarity with this specific facility or training in rapid structural assessment that goes beyond standard military instruction. The observation was accurate and dangerous because it indicated that Hayes possessed enough tactical knowledge to recognize the sophisticated nature of Sophia's performance. His question wasn't based on suspicion or curiosity. It was based on professional assessment that identified capabilities which required explanation. Sophia's teammates listened to the interrogation with growing awareness that they had been working alongside someone whose military background was far more complex than any of them had imagined. Philip showed particular interest in the line of questioning, recognizing that Sophia's tactical expertise had exceeded his own despite years of conventional military training that he had considered comprehensive. Crawford regained control of the questioning with the assertiveness of someone who felt his authority was being challenged by circumstances he didn't understand. Reeves, I'm ordering you to provide detailed explanation of your tactical training background. Your performance during this exercise suggests capabilities that are inconsistent with your personnel records, and that inconsistency requires immediate resolution. The direct order created a situation that Sophia had hoped to avoid, a formal military command that required response while potentially compromising security protocols that protected classified operations. She could refuse to answer and face disciplinary action for disobeying a direct order, or she could provide explanations that might expose information about missions that officially didn't exist. Sophia stood at attention with the perfect military bearing that had been drilled into her during training that went far beyond anything the people questioning her had experienced. Her eyes focused on a point beyond Crawford's shoulder while she calculated responses that might satisfy immediate command concerns without violating the security protocols that had kept Desert Talon operatives alive during missions where exposure meant death. Sir, Sophia said finally, her voice carrying a quality that suggested she was prepared to provide information that would change the nature of their conversation entirely. My tactical background includes training that requires security clearance, verification before details can be discussed in this setting. The response was both acknowledgement and warning confirmation that Sophia possessed classified military experience, while indicating that further inquiry would need to follow protocols designed for handling sensitive information. Crawford found himself facing a situation that exceeded his administrative authority while potentially involving security classifications that were beyond his clearance level. The interrogation had reached a critical point where continued questioning would either expose classified information or force Sophia to refuse direct orders from superior officers. The storm that had been building since her arrival at Fort Daniels was about to break, with consequences that would extend far beyond the routine evaluation that Crawford had planned to demonstrate his authority over a soldier whose presence had made him uncomfortable. What happened next would determine whether Sophia could maintain the protective anonymity that had concealed her true identity, or whether the truth about Operation Desert Talon would finally emerge from the shadows where it had been hidden for 3 years. Crawford's face flushed with the kind of anger that emerged when junior personnel attempted to invoke security protocols that challenged his authority. His military career had been built on maintaining control over situations through aggressive assertion of rank and regulation, and Sophia's reference to classified training represented exactly the kind of bureaucratic obstruction that he had learned to overcome through determined pressure. Soldier Reeves, Crawford said, his voice carrying the dangerous edge that preceded disciplinary action. I am your commanding officer at this facility, and I am ordering you to explain your tactical background immediately. Security classifications do not exempt you from answering direct questions about your qualifications for this training program. Sophia remained at attention, her expression neutral, despite recognizing that Crawford was escalating the confrontation beyond professional inquiry into personal conflict. His understanding of security protocols was limited to standard military classifications, and he clearly didn't recognize the implications of her reference to training that required special clearance verification. Sergeant Major Wells stepped forward with the calm authority of someone who had encountered classified operations throughout her 30-year career. Her experience with special operations personnel had taught her to recognize the linguistic patterns and behavioral indicators that characterize soldiers whose service records contained information that couldn't be discussed in standard military settings. Captain Crawford, Wells said carefully, her voice carrying respectful disagreement with a superior officer whose approach was potentially compromising security protocols. If Reeves is referencing classified training that requires clearance verification, we may need to follow appropriate channels rather than pursuing immediate disclosure in this setting. Crawford turned toward Wells with the frustrated expression of someone whose authority was being questioned by subordinates who seemed more concerned with bureaucratic procedures than with immediate command decisions. Sergeant Major, this soldier has been operating under false pretenses for 5 weeks, demonstrating capabilities that exceed her documented background while refusing to participate in unit cohesion activities. That behavior pattern suggests either deception or insubordination, both of which require immediate address. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes had been studying digital recordings of the tactical exercise on his tablet, his attention focused on specific moments where Sophia's guidance had demonstrated knowledge that went beyond conventional military training. His expertise in tactical instruction allowed him to recognize techniques that were characteristic of special operations rather than standard infantry procedures. Reeves, Hayes said, approaching the questioning from a different angle. Your tactical recommendations during the exercise exhibited familiarity with advanced urban warfare protocols that are typically reserved for specialized units. Can you identify where you received training in those specific techniques? The question was more sophisticated than Crawford's aggressive demands, demonstrating professional recognition that Sophia's performance required explanation that went beyond simple deflection. Hayes was probing for information about specialized military instruction that would account for capabilities he could identify but not fully understand. Sophia calculated her response carefully, recognizing that continued evasion would only intensify scrutiny while potentially compromising the security protocols that protected not just her own identity, but the operational methods that kept other classified personnel safe. But revealing details about Desert Talon would violate clearance requirements that existed for legitimate national security reasons. Sir, Sophia replied, her voice maintaining the measured professionalism that had characterized all her responses. My previous training included specialized urban warfare instruction that emphasized tactical problem solving under stress. The specific methodologies require security verification before details can be discussed with personnel who haven't been cleared for that information. Crawford's patience finally reached its breaking point. The careful deflection and bureaucratic references had transformed what he intended as a straightforward, disciplinary action into a complex situation that challenged his authority while suggesting that Sophia possessed connections or clearances that exceeded his own administrative reach. That's enough, Crawford declared, his voice carrying across the training field, with volume that drew attention from soldiers who had been observing the debrief from a distance. Reeves, I am ordering you to remove your uniform top immediately. If you have specialized training tattoos or identification marks that explain your background, we're going to examine them right now. The order struck the evaluation platform like a physical blow, creating shocked silence among the instructors who recognized that Crawford had crossed boundaries that separated legitimate military discipline from inappropriate personal humiliation. Ordering a soldier to remove uniform components in front of assembled personnel violated multiple regulations while potentially exposing the very classified information that security protocols were designed to protect. Sophia's teammates looked at each other with expressions that ranged from confusion to outright discomfort as they realized they were witnessing something that exceeded normal military procedure. Phillips, who had been advocating for aggressive action against Sophia throughout their time at Fort Daniels, appeared uncertain about Crawford's approach to resolving questions about her background. Wells stepped forward with the authoritative presence of someone whose rank and experience provided her with both the obligation and the authority to intervene in situations that violated military protocol. Captain Crawford, that order is inappropriate and potentially compromising to security classifications that may be involved in this situation. But Crawford had committed to a course of action that he viewed as necessary to resolve questions that had been undermining his authority since Sophia's arrival at the facility. Sergeant Major, this soldier has been operating under suspicious circumstances for 5 weeks while demonstrating capabilities that suggest either classified background or deliberate deception. Either way, we need immediate clarification. Sophia understood that the confrontation had reached a point where Crawford's personal agenda had overcome his professional judgment, creating a situation that would either expose classified information or force her to refuse direct orders in front of hundreds of witnesses. The careful balance she had maintained for 5 weeks was finally collapsing under pressure that exceeded her ability to deflect through passive resistance. She could comply with Crawford's order and risk exposing the tattoo that would immediately identify her connection to Operation Desert Talon, potentially compromising security protocols that protected ongoing classified operations. Or she could refuse the order and face court-martial proceedings that would inevitably lead to investigation of her background through official channels that would ultimately reveal the same information. Sophia reached for the zipper of her uniform top with movements that appeared calm and professional, despite the recognition that her decision would change everything. The metal teeth separated with a soft sound that seemed impossibly loud in the desert silence, while hundreds of soldiers watched a confrontation that none of them fully understood, but all of them recognized as significant. As the fabric fell away to reveal the plain olive tank top underneath, Sophia could sense the shift in energy across the training field. Crawford leaned forward with the satisfaction of someone whose aggressive approach was finally producing results, while the instructors watched with professional concern for a situation that had escalated beyond their comfort level. Sophia turned slightly to adjust her position in the desert heat. That movement revealed what had been hidden beneath her uniform for 5 weeks. A tattoo between her shoulder blades that made Sergeant Major Wells take a sharp breath and caused Lieutenant Colonel Hayes to step forward with sudden recognition. The Iron Eagle insignia emerged into view like a ghost materializing from shadow. A snarling eagle's head surrounded by crossed lightning bolts and 7 stars arranged in a pattern that looked random to most observers, but carried specific meaning for anyone with knowledge of classified special operations. The artwork was intricate and professional, but more importantly, it was a symbol that identified membership in units that officially didn't exist. Crawford's satisfaction vanished as he recognized that his aggressive approach to resolving Sophia's mysterious background had uncovered information that exceeded his clearance level and potentially his authority to handle. The Iron Eagle wasn't just a military tattoo, it was identification of participation in operations that were classified beyond normal military security protocols. The silence that followed the revelation of Sophia's tattoo was absolute, the kind of profound quiet that occurs when reality shifts so dramatically that everyone present requires time to process what they're witnessing. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes stood frozen at the edge of the evaluation platform, his tablet forgotten in hands that had gone slack with recognition. The Iron Eagle insignia wasn't just familiar to him. It was a symbol he had encountered in classified briefings that carried security restrictions he had never expected to see manifested on a soldier standing in front of him. Sergeant Major Wells moved with the careful precision of someone approaching something dangerous and unpredictable. Her 30 years of military experience included exposure to special operations that existed in the shadows of conventional military structure, and the Iron Eagle tattoo represented participation in missions that were compartmentalized beyond normal security classifications. Her eyes tracked from the tattoo to Sophia's face with the kind of professional assessment that came from recognizing capabilities she had heard described but never witnessed directly. Captain Crawford's expressions cycled through confusion, recognition, and dawning horror as he began to understand the implications of what his aggressive confrontation had uncovered. The Iron Eagle wasn't a standard military insignia that could be explained through conventional service records. It identified participation in operations so classified that their existence was barely acknowledged by Pentagon officials who possessed clearance levels that exceeded his own administrative authority. The approaching sound of vehicles drew everyone's attention toward the base's administrative complex, where official cars were moving with the kind of purposeful speed that indicated emergency response to developing situations. Radio communications crackled across multiple frequencies as word of the situation reached command levels that possessed authority to address circumstances involving classified operations and personnel whose service records required special handling procedures. General William Morrison emerged from the lead vehicle with the measured authority of someone whose military career had been built on managing crises that existed at the intersection of national security and operational secrecy. At 68, he carried himself with the confident bearing that came from 40 years of making decisions that shaped military policy while maintaining public ignorance of operations that were essential to national defense, but invisible to civilian oversight. Morrison's presence at Fort Daniels represented intervention from command levels that most base personnel would never encounter throughout their entire military careers. His authority extended beyond conventional military hierarchy into the shadowy realm of special operations that were compartmentalized beyond normal security classifications, and his arrival indicated that Sophia's exposure had triggered responses from the highest levels of Pentagon command structure. Behind Morrison, Colonel Amanda Sterling carried briefcases that contained documentation requiring security clearances that exceeded anything available to personnel currently stationed at Fort Daniels. Her role as liaison between Special Operations Command and conventional military administration made her uniquely qualified to manage situations where classified personnel were inadvertently exposed to scrutiny that compromised operational security. The assembled soldiers on the training field recognized immediately that they were witnessing something far beyond routine military procedure. General Morrison's arrival transformed what had begun as disciplinary action against a problematic recruit into official intervention that suggested national security implications none of them had anticipated when they gathered to observe tactical evaluations. Morrison approached the evaluation platform with purposeful stride that drew the attention of every person within visual range. His uniform bore insignia and decorations that indicated participation in operations spanning multiple decades in conflict zones, while his bearing projected the kind of absolute authority that came from making life and death decisions under conditions where hesitation meant failure. Captain Crawford, Morrison said, his voice carrying across the training field with clarity that reached every soldier within hearing distance. Who authorized you to expose classified operational tattoos in a public setting? The question struck Crawford like a physical blow, confirming that his order for Sophia to remove her uniform top had violated security protocols that protected not just individual operatives, but entire operational frameworks that remained classified for national security reasons. His attempt to resolve questions about Sophia's background had inadvertently compromised information that was designed to remain hidden from personnel who lacked appropriate clearance levels. Crawford's response came in stammered fragments that revealed his growing understanding of the magnitude of his error. Sir, I was attempting to clarify discrepancies in Soldier Reeves' background that were affecting unit cohesion and training effectiveness. Her tactical performance suggested capabilities that exceeded her documented qualifications. Morrison's expression indicated professional assessment of leadership failure that went beyond simple procedural error into the realm of security compromise that could affect ongoing operations and personnel safety. Captain Operation Desert Talon personnel carry special classifications that require Pentagon-level authorization before their backgrounds can be investigated or exposed. The mention of Operation Desert Talon by name created shocked silence among the assembled instructors and soldiers who recognized that they were witnessing official acknowledgement of classified operations that were legendary within military circles but never discussed in conventional settings. Sophia's connection to Desert Talon explained not just her tactical expertise, but her presence at Fort Daniels under circumstances that had generated questions throughout her 5-week assignment. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes stepped forward with the respectful attention that senior officers showed when addressing general-level command in situations involving classified information. Sir, we were unaware of Reeves's operational background. Her performance during tactical exercises exhibited capabilities that suggested specialized training, but we had no access to classification information that would have explained her expertise. Morrison nodded with understanding that came from extensive experience managing situations where classified personnel operated under cover identities that were designed to protect both individual operatives and operational security. Colonel Hayes' Operation Desert Talon operatives are assigned to conventional facilities for observation and evaluation purposes that cannot be discussed without appropriate security clearance. Reeves's presence here serves objectives that extend beyond normal training protocols. Sophia finally spoke, her voice carrying the measured professionalism that had characterized all her communications, but now directed toward command authority that understood the true nature of her background and assignment. Sir, I apologize for the security exposure. The tactical situation required intervention that revealed capabilities I was attempting to keep concealed. Morrison's attention focused on Sophia with the kind of professional assessment that came from evaluating operatives whose service records included missions that officially didn't exist. Reeves, your tactical intervention during the exercise was appropriate given the circumstances. However, the exposure of your operational background creates complications that require immediate address. Colonel Sterling approached the platform with documentation that would begin the process of managing security exposure while protecting information that remained classified despite Sophia's inadvertent revelation. Her expertise in handling situations where classified operations intersected with conventional military structure made her essential for resolving circumstances that could affect ongoing national security operations. The weeks that followed General Morrison's intervention at Fort Daniels unfolded with the swift precision that characterized military justice when security protocols had been compromised through leadership failure. Captain James Crawford found himself facing a court-martial inquiry that examined not just his inappropriate order to expose Sophia's tattoo, but his complete failure to recognize the authority and classification level of a Pentagon-level operative whose presence at the base served purposes that exceeded his clearance to understand. The inquiry board that convened to review Crawford's conduct included officers whose experience with classified operations allowed them to assess the full scope of his security violations. Their conclusions were unambiguous. Crawford's aggressive pursuit of disciplinary action against Sophia had compromised operational security through reckless disregard for protocols designed to protect both individual operatives and ongoing mission effectiveness. His military career effectively ended within 72 hours of General Morrison's arrival. Sergeant Rebecca Mason discovered that her campaign to document Sophia's problematic behavior had been recorded in multiple formats that reached her commanding officers with devastating clarity. Video footage of Mason publicly mocking a classified operative whose service record included missions essential to national security created consequences that extended beyond simple disciplinary action into permanent reassignment to positions where her judgment could cause minimal damage to military effectiveness. Corporal Nathan Phillips learned that his confrontational approach towards Sophia during the tactical exercise had involved challenging a Desert Talent operative whose authority superseded normal military hierarchy. The incident was documented as insubordination towards superior personnel, carrying career implications that would follow him throughout his military service while ending any possibility of advancement to leadership positions. Private Tyler Johnson's aggressive questioning of Sophia's credentials was reviewed as harassment of classified personnel, resulting in immediate discharge from advanced training programs and reassignment to positions that would never again provide access to operations involving national security considerations. His military career was reduced to routine administrative duties that reflected his demonstrated inability to recognize competence when it was concealed beneath unassuming appearances. But the most significant transformation occurred in Sophia herself as General Morrison's intervention provided her with opportunities to channel her experience with Operation Desert Talon into constructive change that could prevent similar losses in the future. The exposure of her background had ended the protective anonymity she had maintained for 3 years, but it also opened pathways for applying her expertise in ways that could save lives, while honoring the memory of the 11 operatives who hadn't returned from missions that officially never occurred. Within a month of the confrontation at Fort Daniels, Sophia was appointed as Director of Advanced Tactical Training, a position created specifically to incorporate lessons learned from classified operations into conventional military instruction. Her office at the Pentagon carried authority that allowed her to reshape training protocols across all branches of the military, ensuring that future operatives would benefit from tactical knowledge that had been purchased through sacrifice and survival during missions where failure meant death. Sophia's first initiative involved complete revision of urban warfare training scenarios, replacing theoretical exercises with realistic simulations based on actual combat conditions that special operations personnel encountered during classified missions. The sanitized training programs that had dominated military instruction were replaced with challenging scenarios that tested decision-making under pressure while preparing soldiers for the kind of tactical complexities that could only be understood through real-world experience. Her influence extended beyond tactical training into cultural transformation, that addressed the prejudices and assumptions that had characterized her treatment at Fort Daniels. Sophia implemented evaluation systems that prioritized practical competence over theoretical knowledge, while establishing protocols that recognized capability regardless of how it was packaged or presented. The casual dismissal of quiet competence that had marked her early weeks at the base was replaced by institutional awareness that true strength often remained concealed until circumstances required its revelation. The Iron Eagle tattoo that had ended her anonymity became a symbol of hidden expertise throughout military culture, representing the principle that appearances could be fatally deceiving when assessing capability or threat levels. Training facilities across all branches of the military adopted Sophia's core doctrine: never underestimate someone based on surface characteristics, because the most dangerous operatives were often those who appeared least threatening until the moment they chose to demonstrate their true capabilities. 5 years after the confrontation at Fort Daniels, Sophia stood before a congressional committee presenting her annual report on military training effectiveness. The statistics were impressive. Casualty rates during special operations had decreased by 40%. Mission success rates had improved by 50%, and a new generation of military leaders had emerged who understood that competence came in many forms that weren't always immediately recognizable. But beyond the numbers lay cultural transformation that extended throughout the military establishment. The institution that had once dismissed Sophia as weak and unsuitable had learned to recognize that quiet observers might possess the most valuable tactical knowledge, that mysterious backgrounds often concealed essential expertise, and that the soldiers who seemed least impressive might be precisely the ones whose capabilities exceeded conventional understanding. Sophia's office overlooked the Pentagon courtyard where thousands of military personnel moved through their daily routines, most of them unaware that their training protocols had been shaped by lessons learned during missions that remained classified beyond their clearance to access. The framed photograph on her desk showed 12 operatives in combat gear taken the night before Operation Desert Talon commenced, 11 faces that would never age beyond that moment, and Sophia herself, the sole survivor, whose guilt had been transformed into purpose, that honored their sacrifice while protecting others from similar losses. Veterans of the Gulf War who now served as advisors to her program often remarked on how Desert Talon's integration of real-time intelligence with immediate tactical response represented a fundamental shift from their own experiences in '91. Back then, rigid command structures and inflexible planning had sometimes hampered effectiveness in rapidly changing battlefield conditions. The older generation of warriors recognized in Sophia's methodology the evolution of military thinking. They had advocated for decades adaptability, combined with discipline, individual initiative within collective frameworks, and respect for field intelligence over theoretical planning. The knock on her door interrupted thoughts that still returned to that desert night when everything changed. "Come in," she called, recognizing the weight of responsibility that came with each new assignment that required her expertise. To her surprise, James Crawford entered dressed in civilian clothes. 5 years had aged him, lines around his eyes, deeper hair graying at the temples. His posture still military straight, but lacking the aggressive confidence that had characterized his leadership at Fort Daniels. "May I speak with you, Director Reeves?" he asked, his voice carrying the measured tone of someone who had spent years reflecting on past mistakes. Sophia gestured to the chair across from her desk, studying the man whose actions had changed the course of her life. The last she had heard, Crawford had left the military after his court-martial, disappearing into civilian life with the kind of anonymity that she had once sought for herself. "I've been working with veterans transitioning to civilian life," Crawford said after a moment of silence, "helping them find purpose after service. It's different from commanding troops, but rewarding in its own way." Sophia nodded, waiting for him to continue. "What happened at Fort Daniels?" he began, then stopped, choosing his words carefully. "I was wrong, not just about the protocols I violated, but about what makes a soldier valuable to the mission. I measured competence by how well people fit into the system I understood, rather than recognizing that sometimes the system itself needs to adapt." The office fell silent as Sophia considered his words. 5 years ago, she would have dismissed this as tactical contrition from a man seeking career rehabilitation. But there was something in Crawford's eyes that suggested genuine transformation, the kind that only came through painful self-reflection. We all make mistakes, Crawford, she said finally. The difference is what we learn from them. Your program has saved lives, he acknowledged. Changed how we train, how we evaluate. I've seen it firsthand with the veterans I work with now. They talk about the Reeves method like it's revolutionary, never knowing I was the one who exposed you. A slight smile crossed Sophia's face. Perhaps that exposure was necessary. What we learned in Desert Talon couldn't remain classified forever, not if it meant continuing to lose good people to preventable tactical errors. Crawford nodded, his expression thoughtful. The older veterans I work with, the ones from Desert Storm and earlier conflicts, they understand what you're doing better than anyone. They've been saying for decades that the military needs to value adaptability as much as discipline, field intelligence over theoretical planning. They see your program as validation of what they learned through experience. They're not wrong, Sophia agreed. The greatest generation of American warriors knew that quiet competence outweighs showmanship, that results matter more than reputation, and that the best service often happens without acknowledgement. We just institutionalized what they already knew. As Crawford prepared to leave, Sophia offered one final thought. Your experience, both the successes and the failures, gives you perspective that can help others. That's not so different from what I'm doing here. Thank you, Director, Crawford said, his voice carrying genuine gratitude for a forgiveness he hadn't expected to receive. For what it's worth, I think those 11 stars on your back are matched by thousands of invisible ones, the lives your work has saved since Desert Talon. After he departed, a young colonel arrived with documents bearing the highest security classifications. Ma'am, Joint Chiefs have requested your assessment of training protocols for a new classified operation. Timeline is 48 hours. Sophia accepted the folders with the same calm professionalism that had characterized her response to challenges since the day her anonymity was shattered at Fort Daniels. Each new assignment carried the potential to prevent losses that families would never have to endure, tactical knowledge that could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. As she opened the first folder and began reviewing parameters that would test new operatives, Sophia reflected on the truth that had guided her through Desert Talon and every day since true capability didn't announce itself through aggressive display. It waited, observed, and demonstrated precision when circumstances required excellence beyond normal expectations. The evolution of her career from covert operative to Pentagon director echoed the journey of the military itself, from the days when combat experience was something many Americans shared through service in World War II and Korea, to the more specialized professional force where fewer than 1% of Americans served, to the current era, where the lessons of those who had faced combat needed to be carefully preserved and transmitted to each new generation of defenders. In many ways, Sophia's program bridged the generational gap between veterans like Morrison, who had started their careers during the Cold War, and the younger soldiers who had never known a world without constant asymmetric warfare. She had become the translator of institutional wisdom, ensuring that hard-earned lessons weren't lost as older warriors retired and newer ones took their place. When Phillips Johnson and Martinez occasionally appeared in her training seminars, now reformed and reintegrated into the military system, with more humble perspectives, they served as living examples of how attitudes could evolve when confronted with excellence that defied conventional expectations. Their testimony about their initial misjudgment of Sophia carried more weight with young officers than any abstract lecture about hidden capability could ever achieve. The quiet woman who had been publicly humiliated for not looking like a soldier had become the architect of military doctrine that shaped how the most powerful armed forces in the world identified, developed, and deployed specialized capability. Her transformation from dismissed recruit to Pentagon-level authority represented more than personal vindication. It embodied institutional evolution that recognized strength in forms that had previously been overlooked or undervalued. The tattoo on her back remained hidden beneath her uniform, but its meaning had spread throughout military culture as a reminder that true competence didn't require validation through performance or announcement. It simply existed, ready to emerge when circumstances demanded the very best that training, experience, and sacrifice could produce. And in barracks and mess halls across every military installation, veterans now told the semi-mythical story of the day when a captain ordered a soldier to remove her uniform top and discovered he was standing in the presence of an Iron Eagle, a cautionary tale about making assumptions based on appearance that carried the weight of military legend while teaching a lesson that might someday save lives on battlefields no one could yet imagine.